It's time for some of the secrets in the church to come out. And in this expose, we're blowing the lid off of secrets around NDAs, hush money in the church, and other silencing tactics that have been used to cover up scandals and abuse for way too long. That kind of stuff has no business in the church, and we're going to show you how these things are being hidden, where they're being used, the damage they're causing, and what we can do about it. And there are no holds barred. We're going to say some of the stuff that no one wants us to say because these things have to be talked about. It's time for us to get rid of NDAs in the church. It's time that we return to accountability, to transparency, to truth. And it's time that we earn back that trust that people have put in us for so long. The church is better than NDAs. Jesus has called us to be better. So if you want to see the truth behind the curtain, if you want to shine some light on the shadows, then this is the documentary, The Expose, for you, because we're going deep into NDAs in the church and the secrets the church is keeping that it's time to let people know about. NDAs, hush money, and a promise not to tell anyone about the things you've seen. That probably sounds like a story or a movie about corporate greed and the nasty underbelly of the things that go on in the corporate world. But would it surprise you to know it's actually a story about the modern evangelical church? That's right, it's a story about the church because today, churches use NDAs and hush money as much or potentially more than the corporate world, and it causes all sorts of issues, all sorts of damage, but here's the worst part, almost nobody knows. And why doesn't anybody know? Because people have been silenced for so long. With these ironclad agreements, they can't even talk about the fact that the agreements exist. So because this system works so well, most people have no idea how broadly these documents and these silencing tactics are used in the church today. And actually, it's one of the biggest reasons behind the plethora, the myriad of scandals and cover-ups and stories about abuse that keep popping up in the church. They go on for so long that they become really huge deals. They become dangerous and super damaging when maybe they wouldn't have gotten as bad if people could tell the truth. But because of NDAs, because of these silencing agreements and other tactics to keep people quiet, we tend to not know anything's going on in some of these churches until it's too late to fix it and until people have been hurt and they've had damage done to them that's irreparable. Things that we can't just apologize for and take away. Now, before we go any farther, I want to make sure I'm crystal clear on this. This is not every church. Not all churches use NDAs, but the truth is, more churches use NDAs than you or I would generally think. And while this may not be your church, because there are incredible churches out there that believe in transparency, even very transparent churches and organizations may have some leaders who are using NDAs without the rest of the organization knowing. The bottom line is, these NDAs are in more churches than we would ever dream. And as you're going to actually hear in this expose, these NDAs are probably in more churches than not. This has become an almost industry standard, but it doesn't look like Jesus. It doesn't belong in the church. And we are going to talk about, hey, how can we have solid discussions to get the negative parts of these NDAs out? And what can we do to make sure that there is transparency in the church so that we don't have people being silenced and we don't have people who are keeping us from looking and acting like Jesus inside the walls of these churches. Also, before we go any further, let's take a minute and talk about the elephant in the room. Guys, this is uncomfortable. Whether you are a Christian watching this who's an avid churchgoer and believes in the church, or whether you're a non-Christian who has a lot of questions, this is uncomfortable for anybody and everybody who's watching it. The idea of non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement agreements, hush money payments, and people being paid to cover things up and to be silenced in churches, it just doesn't feel right. And the reason why it doesn't feel right is probably because there's some things in there that aren't right. But the good news is, if we can get some of these negative tools out of the church can still be one of the greatest, most helpful organizations on the planet. The church, from the time it started, has had a huge and helpful impact on culture. We don't want that to go away. The church at its best, there's nothing like it. But the church can't be at its best with things like this going on behind the scenes and in the dark. So in this documentary, in this expose, we're going to talk about not only how NDAs are used in the church, we're not only going to educate you about that, we're going to show you case studies, we're going to do all that. But the most important thing we're going to do, we're going to teach you how to have open conversations about these things in your churches. Because as we bring the things we're doing out into the light, then we can start looking and acting much more like Jesus, and we can begin transforming our communities in powerful ways. So if you're ready, join me. Let's jump in and let's start taking a look at NDAs, hush money, and other silencing tactics that are keeping secrets in the church. All right, so before we go any further, let's start out with defining what in the world is an NDA. Some of you, maybe you signed an NDA before, maybe you've drafted one, maybe you know what they are, but for many of us, we're not really familiar, outside of lawyers and people who are in this world, we're not really familiar about what NDAs are. So let's take a look at what an NDA is. And according to an article from Thomson Reuters Legal entitled 4 Things You Should Know About Non-Disclosure Agreements, they say this. They say non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, as they're sometimes called, are legally enforceable agreements between parties that are used to ensure that certain information will remain confidential. So right now, all this means is an NDA. It can be called a lot of different things, as we're going to see here in a moment, but an NDA is designed at its best just to keep certain specific information confidential and to keep it from falling into the hands of the public. That's usually going to be used in business scenarios. So while NDAs, it says, are known by many names, including confidentiality agreements, confidential disclosure agreements, and proprietary information agreements, there's typically one thing that they all have in common. Once an individual signs an NDA, they cannot discuss any information protected by the agreement with a non-authorized party. So if that's information that should be protected in an agreement, that's really good. That means you're protecting proprietary information from getting out and causing harm or damage to a company. When they're dealing with an invention, they're doing something new, they're trying to grow. But if the information being protected is something that shouldn't be protected, something that's just being covered up, that would be an example of an NDA being misused. It's not what it was created for, but still, once an individual signs an NDA, they cannot legally discuss any of the protected information in that agreement, even if it's information that shouldn't be protected. So what does this look like in a good NDA? What kind of information are we talking about being protected? And before we move into that, Thomson Reuters gives some different examples, different names, confidentiality agreements, confidentiality disclosures, all of that, different names of NDAs. You're going to see this later on as well, but some NDAs are never called any of those things. They're simply other contracts that have certain language in them, okay, like non-disparagement clauses that also would make a contract that's not really an NDA. It makes it an NDA when you have those clauses. More often than not, these documents are not going to be called NDAs because people have a really bad view toward NDAs, okay? So they're going to be called a lot of different things, but at their best, they're actually a good document, right? But one of the most common situations, Thomson Reuters says, in which companies use NDAs is when employees have access to confidential information, including things like trade secrets, proprietary processes, client information and client lists, marketing strategies, and any other valuable or sensitive information. Now, I would say those are important things to protect. You want to protect your client list that you procured. You want to be able to protect, your client information and their personal information that they have shared with you not being out and available to the public. It's good to protect things like trade secrets and proprietary processes. The damage comes when we use NDAs in ways outside of this. Since employers don't want employees sharing this information with competitors, or worse, leaving the company and using that confidential information to start their own competing business, they'll often have new employees sign non-disclosure agreements. So when you think about stuff like this, a lot of us think about the tech industry. And when the tech industry first started, you have brand new inventions out there, total proprietary information, proprietary algorithms. So of course, if you're hiring someone and paying them good money to work on these things, you would want them to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that they couldn't just learn from you and either take it to the highest bidder or start their own competing company with the information that you gave them. Again, that's the number one way that these things started. It's what they were designed for, and it's how they've been most often used in business over the last decades. However, there are some things that can happen with NDAs that make them, one, dangerous, okay, and two, not enforceable because they're outside the scope of what they were designed to do. So let's take a look at that. And all of this stuff is going to help us make sense of how these things are misused in churches, okay? So stay with me. I know all this legal jargon can get a little bit boring, but it's going to be really important to understand how churches are misusing these to silence people from talking about things that really should be discussed. When are non-disclosure agreements signed by employees enforceable? Okay, so Thomson Reuters, they're going to say that the rules vary from state to state, but one of the things that has to be a part of an NDA is the agreement must be supported by something called consideration. And that's just a legal term, a legal way of saying that there's a bargain for exchange. Okay, there's an exchange between the two parties. In exchange for your confidentiality, you get this. So originally it was in exchange for confidentiality, you get a job at this tech firm. Sometimes it's in exchange for your confidentiality, you get a payment of money. It could be a settlement. It could be a lot of different things. But there has to be consideration where the parties exchange something. There's a bargain of exchange. And if that's not there, then the NDA's really probably not going to hold up. It's probably not going to be enforceable. Okay, so what are some situations and circumstances that might make an NDA unenforceable? Well, one, if it doesn't have consideration, but another one is if the language in the agreement is too broad and it's too restrictive. These documents were never made. These contracts were never actually intended to be restrictive and keep people from talking about things they're free to talk about. That came later as people started misusing them. They were just designed to protect information that should be protected. But if an NDA today is overly broad or restrictive, it's likely that a court is going to find problems with it, especially if it's not limited in scope or duration. And you're going to see as we go throughout this video, many of these NDAs that churches are using today, there's no scope or duration at all. They're good for the lifetime and sometimes beyond the lifetime of the people who sign them. Not to mention when you can't tell what is confidential and what is not, because often these definitions of confidential information are so broad that almost anything you say at all could cause you to break the NDA. And when that happens, that could actually leave the NDA unenforceable, but most people don't know that. Most people just know that there is a threat that their company, or sadly, their church, could come after them if they say the wrong thing. So when that language is overly broad, people get real quiet because they're scared to make a mistake that's going to land them in court or cause them to lose the livelihood that they've worked so hard for. Now, one of the other questions that people often have that this article actually answers is, okay, so what happens when someone breaks an NDA? And that's a great question, because in some NDAs, it actually labels that. It says, here's what's going to happen if you break this NDA. Here's how you can try to make it right. And in some cases, they're really not that bad at all. It's just good faith exchange. We're going to try to keep confidential information confidential. In others, they basically say we can come after you for any type of damages, or we can come after you for $100,000 or $1 million. And they just go ahead and put it out in there. But according to Thomson Reuters, violating an NDA can have serious consequences. NDAs are legally binding contracts. And if an employee has violated an NDA, then the company may take legal action. The most common claims against an NDA include breach of contract, breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of trade secrets, copyright infringement, and other intellectual property law violations. Again, those are good, and it makes sense to come after a person, when they have cost a company a lot of money. In the church world, a lot of times the breach of contract is talking about what happened at that church or saying anything negative about the church, even if it's true, right? So it becomes you can't talk about anything that happened, and usually there's something that these NDAs are designed to keep quiet, okay? But you've seen so far from Thomson Reuters, when these NDAs are used right, they're used to protect proprietary information, trade secrets, and normal kind of business stuff. It's really not that bad. If you look at, another source, let's get another opinion on this. LegalZoom talks about NDAs, and they say this. What is a non-disclosure agreement? And they give some NDA types, examples, and use, but they say this: non-disclosure agreements protect confidential business information from being prematurely disclosed to the public or falling into the hands of competitors. And again, there's this implied idea in LegalZoom's definition that there's a time limit. There's a time limit on these NDAs because eventually the product or the software or the new invention is going to get out into the public, and then it no longer needs to be kept confidential. But when these are misused, and again, this happens in some churches, they can be good for the lifetime and beyond the lifetime, literally beyond the lifetime of the person who signs it, about this confidentiality. LegalZoom also gives you some good examples here of what a good NDA would be used for in general. So what are some common use cases for non-disclosure agreements? They could be an employer-employee NDA, which helps keep employees from revealing confidential business information. There could be independent contractor agreements, which helps contractors who don't actually work for the company but are doing a job on contract basis for them from revealing confidential business info. Agreements with investors could help ensure that investors don't share your ideas with a competing startup, because that's happened before. Agreements with business associates, and that can help keep information shared in business-to-business meetings private as you're looking to say, hey, could this other business potentially be a partner for us? Let's have a meeting. Let's talk about it. We've got to share what we're working on with them, but we're going to have them sign this NDA because if we don't end up working with them, we don't want them to get mad and then just share that with another competitor. Because that will put us behind the eight ball. That will actually cost us money. And then the last one, agreements in litigation and arbitration between two businesses. Okay, so basically it helps prohibit the disclosure of a legal process outside of that legal process. Now, all of these, again, are really good uses of NDAs. This is what it was designed for. The problem, the scary part of this is that NDAs today are often used way outside of the scope of this design. And where they get farthest from the scope of this design, in my opinion, is actually in churches with Christians, God's people who sometimes we just have some sketchy leaders who are using these to do things they were never designed for. And now they're just keeping secrets that need to come out into the light. That's dangerous. That's sad. It doesn't look like Jesus, and it needs to stop. Hey, Church Disrupted community, if you've experienced religious trauma, church hurt, or spiritual abuse, and you want to heal and let go of your triggers and hurt, then we want to help. The Forgiveness Link and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association are two partners of the podcast that exist to help you leave your trauma behind and start living your best life. Church hurt and spiritual abuse don't have to hold you back anymore. Rob and the Forgiveness Link team will help you leave your trauma behind and experience massive healing in as little as 8 weeks. Their intensive process, it's faith-based, practical, and extremely powerful. I've experienced firsthand the transformative power of the Forgiveness Link process, and I would love to see you experience it as well. Dustin Stitt and the East Tennessee Mentorship team, they'll help you find healing from a different approach. This veteran-owned business is faith-informed and will walk through the healing journey at your own pace with you. From groups to individual sessions, they'll help you continue to take consistent steps forward toward the person that you want to be and the life that you want to live. Both partners can help you transform your life, and we believe in both of them. One is more clinical and delivers fast-paced results, and the other is more relational and works at the pace that you commit to. But please, 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 please don't stay hurting on your own. Your church hurt experiences, they don't have to define you, and they don't have to hold you back any longer. If you're ready to step into healing and leave your trauma behind, please reach out to one of our partners. You can find out more information about them in the description below or at disruptedchurch.church on the Partners tab. You can meet with either of our partners at no cost just to hear how they'll work with you. And also they'll let you know about special rates they have just for Church Disrupted community members. But regardless of which of these two partners you choose to work with, you'll be in good hands. And I can't wait to hear how your life has changed for the good, for the better, because you work with them. So now that we defined NDAs, I want to let you hear from somebody who knows a little bit more about NDAs than me. And we're actually going to hear from a couple of different lawyers. The first lawyer is going to be a secular lawyer who's actually just talking to businesses about the difference between a good and bad NDA. Now, this is going to be a little bit dry in my opinion, but it's really good information. So we're going to listen to just a little bit from this first lawyer and keep in mind, make note of what he tells businesses constitute a bad NDA. And then we're going to hear from Boz Savijan, and he is one of the leaders of Grace. Grace is an organization that exists to kind of stop spiritual abuse in the church. They help with tons of investigations of impropriety in the church. And they're one of the leading groups that does independent investigations when things come up and we're just not sure, hey, is there merit to these accusations or not? So they're helping keep churches safe. But Boz is an attorney who deals with this stuff in churches all the time, and he'll talk about NDAs and what they look like in the church. So let's hear from both of these lawyers. Let's see what we can learn about, one, what does a bad NDA look like? And then two, how are NDAs used, or how might they be used in the church? And let's see if there's any overlap between those bad NDAs that the secular lawyer talks about and these NDAs and how they're used in the church. All right, so the first lawyer we're going to hear from is John Farrell. He's an attorney with Monopoly Patents, and he's talking about the signs and red flags of a bad NDA. So let's start out with his definition. What exactly is an NDA, or a non-disclosure agreement?
What is a non-disclosure agreement? It's an agreement to keep a secret. It's an I won't say anything if you won't. You've heard of the kiss and tell? Well, this is the kiss and shut up. An NDA is a contract between two or more people to preserve the confidentiality of information. It's not known by others who are not party to the agreement.
So he says, you've heard of kiss and tell. This is a kiss and shut up. Right? This is a silencing agreement. And at the end of the day, from a totally secular lawyer who's talking to business leaders who use these NDAs, he wants to make it clear that's what an NDA is. An NDA is a document that says, we're going to talk about this, you're going to know some things, but then you're going to shut up about these things, right? And although that makes some sense in business, it feels really weird to talk about something like that in the church. But John pulls no punches. He wants to let you know this is what an NDA does. This is what an NDA is for. And it's not a play agreement. It's not a soft little agreement. This is a serious agreement that will keep people silent about the things that they know. But the other thing he wants us to know is that NDAs also, they're contracts. So let's listen in and think about what these contracts look like, and what places would you see them potentially being used for good reasons in the church?
NDAs are contracts governed by the laws of the various states.
All right, so it's very simple, but NDAs are, at the end of the day, contracts. That's what they are. They're contracts for silence. That is one of the simplest ways I know how to describe an NDA. It is a contract for the silence of one party, right? And there's going to be an exchange of consideration or a bargain, an exchange between the two. For your silence, I'm going to give you this, or you're going to give me this for your silence, right? That's what it looks like. All right, so now that we've been introduced to John and he's talked about what an NDA is, let's take a look at 5 warning signs he's going to give us of a bad NDA, or things to look out for that make these less than what they're supposed to be, things that can actually make them dangerous.
Now, let's talk about the 5 terms to watch out for before signing an NDA. These are the 5 snakes in the grass that will bite you in the ankle if you're not careful in reviewing your NDA before executing it.
So he calls these literal snakes in the grass. These are things that don't belong in NDAs. Even in business, they're snakes in the grass that are just designed to fool you or manipulate you or get one over on you or get power above you. So listen to these, because you're going to actually notice as we talk about these later, you're going to see some of these same 5 red flags, these same 5 snakes in the grass, as he calls them, used in NDAs that are used by churches. Right? And if they have no place in the business world, then they definitely have no place in the church world. But let's listen in and find out what these red flags, these dangerous things included in NDAs are.
Red flag number 1, non-mutual or non-reciprocal terms. Non-mutuality means that I'm required to keep your secret, but the agreement is silent on your obligation to do anything, or the obligations of the 2 parties are different.
All right. So he talks about non-mutual terms. And some of the worst NDAs that I've seen in the church world, and you're going to see this. We're going to break down actual NDAs later, and you're going to be able to see exactly what these NDAs look like that churches are having people sign, why they're so dangerous. You're going to see some of this language in there that for, sometimes just a couple of weeks of pay or a couple of months of pay, now you have to be silent about things you've seen, even if they were wrong, even if they were dangerous, even if they didn't look like Jesus. You have to be silent about them for the rest of your life. You can't talk to anybody. Sometimes you can't even talk to your spouse or a therapist about them. So for the rest of your life, silence about these important things will trade you a few weeks of salary. That's a non-mutual term, and that's one of the things that John says we need to watch out here for in bad NDAs. That's whether it's in the business world or the church world, but that's one red flag you're definitely going to see in church-used NDAs. Let's go to red flag number 2.
Red flag number 2, an unreasonable or subjective definition of confidential.
All right, so the second red flag is an unreasonable definition of confidentiality, or what exactly is supposed to be kept confidential. And again, I'm not going to get too far into this. You're going to see this when we break down real life in-use NDAs from these churches. But oftentimes the definition of confidential is so broad that you don't know if you're breaking it or not. And honestly, at any given moment, you could be breaking it. This is one of the reasons why people get so scared of these NDAs, because they don't realize that they're not just NDAs in the church, which throws them off. We don't realize that they're often really bad NDAs that may not be enforceable in court because of the way that they were drafted. But let's go on to John's red flag number 3.
Red flag number 3, longer than necessary terms. How long is a secret really good for? The longer the contract, the more costly it is to manage, and the more likely it is to be breached accidentally. Keep the term short. Obviously, the lifetime of your last unborn child may be way too long. Make sure the term of the agreement somehow relates to the value of the secret being kept.
All right, so longer than necessary terms is red flag number 3. And John says there should be an end date to these things. And you want the term to be as short as possible, because the longer the term, the more problems they're going to come up with this. But again, when we break down these real life NDAs, you're going to notice that more than not, they don't have an end date at all. They're for a person's lifetime, they're in perpetuity, and because there's no end date, it puts people at a real disadvantage to talk about anything that happened at that church or at that job or during that experience. So even a secular attorney here is saying any good NDA should have reasonable terms. It should be a short length, and usually 3 to 5 years is about as long as you're going to find on these. Oftentimes they're shorter than that, but definitely not a good idea to sign any NDA that is a lifetime agreement. So let's go to red flag number 4 and hear what John has to say about that.
Warning sign number 4, conditions that are difficult to manage. Beware of conditions that are difficult to manage.
All right, conditions that are difficult to manage. And again, this comes back often to, it can look a lot of different ways in the business world, but in the church world, it often comes back to things like definitions that aren't clear and other specific conditions about who you can't tell that make it even more ironclad than your general NDA. So conditions like you can't say this, but also your spouse can't talk about it, and your kids can't talk about it, and their kids can't talk about it. That's going to be a condition that's hard to manage, right? Some of these non-disclosure agreements you're actually going to see, they have disparagement clauses to where they essentially say you can't say anything that might or could possibly embarrass the church that you were at. Well, that's very subjective and difficult to manage, because even if someone asks you about your time at that church and you said something as simple as no comment, that could actually be embarrassing to them. Right? There's an argument for that. So that makes these conditions very hard to manage, because unless you tell a lie that makes them look great, anything else could actually cause you to break that NDA because it is so broad and, again, subjective. You don't know what might or could embarrass that church, so you end up not saying anything at all, or you end up telling lies to make sure that you don't accidentally break this NDA. So that was red flag number 4. Let's go to the final red flag from John, red flag number 5 of a bad NDA.
Okay, red flag number 5, penalty clauses. Sometimes breach is unavoidable, and the remedy or compensation for breach of an NDA should be related and commensurate with the breach. Don't accept excessive penalty clauses.
All right, so don't accept excessive penalty clauses, because even he says sometimes there's no way around it. You're going to break that non-disclosure because life happens and is not as simple as an agreement. Now, some of these NDAs, they're actually going to say, we're going to go ahead and show you what the penalty is. And it may be in the hundreds of thousands of dollar range. Sometimes it'll say, hey, the penalty is we got to meet for mediation and figure out the best way to remedy this, right? But other times, and this is what we see a lot in churches, it simply says that they can take any means necessary to recover the damage that they feel like has been done by you to the church's reputation. They can go after you legally. They can sue you, not only for the severance money that maybe was exchanged between the NDA and your silence, right? But they can go after you for what they consider reputational damage. And because it is so broad and it's so scary, oftentimes people are terrified, guys. They are terrified to talk about these NDAs because they don't know if what's the church going to do? Are they going to secretly come after us for everything that we're worth? And if they do come after us and they try to take everything that we have, well, if we talk about it, are we further breaking the NDA? Is that going to make the lawsuit even worse? So because people are so scared, they live their lives terrified and say nothing, even sometimes when they see that the stuff they're keeping quiet is actually hurting other people to this day. That's dangerous. It shouldn't happen. And guys, it doesn't feel like those sort of things should happen in the church. But John says, even outside the church, any NDA that has these 5 red flags, that's probably a bad NDA that you don't want to sign. And sadly, I've seen all of these red flags in real NDAs that are currently being used by churches. We're going to share a lot of those with you later. There's also many that we haven't been given permission to share with you yet, but we've been able to look over them anonymously, and I can tell you, these red flags of bad NDAs, these warning signs of bad NDAs, they're all over NDAs that are in the church today. All right, so now that we've heard from a secular lawyer in John, let's hear from a Christian attorney, Boz Savidjian from Grace. And Grace is the godly response to abuse in Christian environments. So Boz is not only one of the leaders of Grace, but Boz is a practicing attorney, and he's going to talk about what NDAs are and how they're used in general. Let's hear from Boz.
So Boz, can you explain to us, talk a little bit about what exactly is an NDA? What kind of forms can we expect to find them in? And what are their legitimate purposes and uses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hear all the time people ask, well, I don't want to sign an NDA or this, NDA that, and very seldom, if ever, will you encounter an agreement that actually is entitled an NDA. And so what you have to do is go, okay, what are we really talking about? And so the NDA is sort of like a generic term that more often than time, at least in my career, I see them under the name of a confidentiality provision. A confidentiality provision that finds its way in employment contracts, severance agreements or employment separation agreements, and oftentimes in settlement agreements in legal cases. I do think you do find some of them, I've never been a part of this, in these church covenant agreements. Like if you want to join a church, you sign this covenant agreement, whatever that means, other than just handing a bunch of control over to a bunch of men. But the reality is sometimes those agreements contain these confidentiality provisions. So we say, well, confidentiality of what?
All right, so you heard from Boz. NDAs are rarely called NDAs, and oftentimes what makes a contract an NDA is actually just a single provision or a single confidentiality clause that is in the contract. And that one paragraph clause can have all of the red flags of that John talked about because it's overly broad, because it's overly restrictive. So one of the things he wants to make sure that we know is oftentimes people don't even know that what they're signing is an NDA. These are clauses and provisions that are snuck into things like severance agreements. They're also snuck into things like employee handbooks when you first start working at a business, but also when you first start working at a church. And he said in some cases, he's known of these to be used in church covenant agreements, where you sign on a church covenant for membership and don't realize, if you're not paying attention, there's a confidentiality clause in that actually makes that church covenant an ironclad NDA. So if you ever see anything in the church and you say, you know what, we're going to take this public, this isn't right, we got to fix this, those church leaders may be quick to remind you that actually as a church member, you signed an NDA. And if you say anything, they can come after you, they can sue you, and they can teach you a lesson. So you had better keep your mouth shut. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like the church to me. It does kind of sound like the mob or a gang coming after you if you talk about something you're not supposed to. But it definitely doesn't sound like a church or people who are supposed to be representing Jesus. So now that we've heard from Boz about what an NDA is in a nutshell, let's hear about some ways that NDAs might show up or might be used in the church. These are places he's seen them be used often in church environments in his work with Grace. Let's take a look.
You get a contract when you go to work. Some of these churches, you start a church, they give you a pack of paper. And I can tell you, because I've had employees who do this. You start a job, they give you all this stuff, you do the first day, review this, sign it, get it back to us. You're so excited to be at this job. You're looking at stuff, you're not even reading it, you're just signing it, okay? There's a good likelihood you might be signing a confidentiality provision that says, listen, the consideration for this is that we're gonna hire you. So we're going to hire you. We don't have to, hiring you is not something we have to do, but we're choosing to hire you. In exchange for hiring you, you're going to sign this paperwork. And one of the documents happens to be an NDA or a confidentiality provision. So practical advice, read stuff before you sign it, especially if it's at that beginning part of employment where everything looks wonderful and everybody's happy and you're just signing stuff and you're so glad to have a job. No, take time to read it. And you might have to make a hard decision if you come across one of these agreements that they're asking you to sign. You might have to come to a part where you go, wow, I thought I was going to take this job, but now I'm not, because I'm not going to sign off on this.
All right, so one of the first ways that Boz says he sees NDAs used in the church is at the start of employment. And you're going to see a little bit later some actual handbooks that include provisions like this, but they'll often be, a single contract at the beginning of employment. More often than not, though, they're tucked into new employee handbooks where you have to sign and say you understand the handbook and all of that. And you may not realize if you don't watch it close that you're signing a lifelong confidentiality agreement right there that is overly broad. It's not just about protecting people's information that you may see in the church or information where you might counsel them, but it's really protecting anything that you know that happens in the church that the public doesn't know. So we'll look at one of those later. But Boz says be very careful and look for those hidden confidentiality agreements when you start. All right. But let's take a look at another way that Boz sees NDAs show up in the church.
But then on the other end, let me just finish real quick. On the other end of it is when you're leaving employment and they want to give you money, just like Scott was talking about. I have talked to people who are suddenly told you're gone. And I've talked to people, Scott, who have said, we want you to decide in 15 minutes whether you sign this agreement or not. And the agreement says we'll give you sometimes 3 months severance. Okay? But in exchange for that, you have to sign all these things, including a non-disparagement clause, a confidentiality clause. And these poor people are in this position going, what do? I really need this money, but I already know this is not a good idea. And so many of them feel forced in signing this. And the problem is they may get 3 months of severance, but that NDA or that non-disparagement provision doesn't have an end life.
Yeah.
So you're getting this amount of money to promise something back to them this much.
Yeah.
And so that's on the other end. And I've talked to more and more and just counseled more and more people. If you don't want to sign something that has a non-disclosure or confidentiality provision or non-disparagement, try to negotiate that out. And if they won't take it out, walk. And I know it's easy. People say, yeah, but I need the money. I know you need the money, but you know what? 6 months, a year from now, you would have spent that money and you're still going to be held to this ridiculous contract that you signed.
So Boz says these NDAs aren't just used at the beginning of employment, but one of the places that he sees them most, and I can corroborate this is where I've seen them most, is at the end of employment. Because when someone is leaving employment, whether you are firing them or at times when they resign, and they know some things that you don't want them telling other people about, well, you can take that moment where they're scared about their future. What are they going to do for a paycheck? What are they going to do next? Offer them a severance, but in exchange for the severance, that's the consideration. You ask them to sign a confidentiality clause that is ironclad that will keep them from talking about this for the rest of their life. Now, you're going to notice multiple of the red flags that John Farrell talked about of a bad NDA in those types of severance agreements. And one of the biggest ones, though, is the non-mutual terms and it not having an end date. That for just that tiny little bit of severance for a few weeks of pay, or usually at max a few months of pay, for people who aren't making a lot of money and they don't know better, they're silenced for the rest of their lives. And eventually, they regret it. I hear from so many people who regret signing their NDAs because it keeps them silent for the rest of their lives, and they feel guilty that there are things they should be speaking up against. They should be speaking up about things, sin that happen not only to them, but is still happening in the church, and they can't because they took that little bit of severance money. And again, most of the time it's a little bit. Sometimes, as you're going to see, it's a really big pile of severance money. But Boz says that's one of the places he sees this happen most is at the end of employment with severance agreements. That's where I see it. And again, note, they're not called NDAs. They are called severance agreements, and they have non-disclosure and non-disparagement clauses or provisions that are actually included in them. So you're going to hear as we go throughout this today, you're going to hear some pastors use the excuse that they don't have people sign NDAs. They just have them sign severance agreements with these provisions. And when you hear that, you're going to know they're liars because you've heard an attorney talking about what an NDA actually is. And just having these provisions, yes, it does make these contracts an NDA, which makes the severance hush money because you're paying money to have someone hush, right? To shut up, to be silent. So let's hear a little bit more about that from Boz.
Final kind of confidentiality provision that I think a lot of people associate with an NDA is where you cannot talk about any of the facts that surround whatever this issue is. So whether it's a settlement agreement, and that, which means I can't talk about I can't even talk about the fact that there is a settlement agreement.
Isn't that crazy, by the way, that sometimes these settlement agreements or these severance agreements, they actually have a clause in there that says, I can't even acknowledge that there was an agreement. I can't even tell someone, I can't talk about that because I signed an NDA. If you even mention that you signed an NDA, you're breaking the NDA. That seems absolutely crazy to me.
I can't talk about the facts leading up to the claim that I'm making. Or if it's a separation agreement from employment, I'm agreeing not to talk about any of the facts related to what led me up to separate my employment with this church or this organization. That's really what I call a gag order. That's saying to somebody, you cannot share your story, whatever it was, whether it was being sexually abused at a church, whether it was being spiritually abused by church leaders. When you sign that agreement, you're signing away your ability to share that story.
All right, so Boz actually calls this a gag order. Because even if you're sharing something from your story that was factual, even if it's factual, it doesn't matter if it could potentially embarrass that church or if it's something they deemed confidential in their broad definition of confidentiality. So this doesn't just say you can't not gossip or you can't not say things that aren't true. This is saying, hey, you can't even say things that are true. But in this last clip from Boz, you're going to actually hear him talk about what I think is one of the most dangerous parts of these NDAs. It's one of the ways that churches, they use this type of clause, this type of language to hide NDAs, to use the excuse that they're not using NDAs. And this particular clause he's about to talk about, this particular provision and language, is often the broadest. Okay, it's the broadest. It covers everything. This is the one that I've seen silence people the most for the longest and do the most damage. So let's hear Boz as he talks about what is called non-disparagement provisions.
Real quick about NDAs is oftentimes within this context of these types of agreements, you have what we call non-disparagement provisions. Oftentimes, non-disparagement provisions are linked to these confidentiality provisions. And a non-disparagement provision is basically says that the party or parties, usually it's just pointing one way, and that's to the employee.
I think that's important to know. Again, non-mutual terms. A lot of these NDAs, they're only talking about the silence of one party. It doesn't give any provision about what the church could say about the previous employee or what the church could say about the member. So what that means is the staff member or the volunteer or the former church member may not be able to say a single thing that might embarrass their church, but the church can imply things or even say things that destroy their character. And because of the NDA, they can't even come back and say, that's not true. They can't talk about it at all. I think that's really, really dangerous.
The parties or the party cannot disparage the church or anybody in leadership at the church. And so that begs the question, what some of you are asking is, what does that mean? Disparage. And that's another way I found, it's a roundabout way of enforcing a confidentiality. Because NDAs today, ever since Harvey Weinstein, which is a good thing, have a bad name. When you mention NDA, the state of California has outlawed NDAs in settlement agreements on cases that have been filed. So it's a bad. So how do we get around that? Well, we're not going to call it an NDA. We're not even going to call it a confidentiality provision. We're going to call it a non-disparagement provision, which, if you think about it, ultimately has the same impact as a confidentiality provision.
And I think that's super important. Keep that in mind. This is going to come back up later, and you're going to realize when it does how important it is. Those non-disparagement provisions are the same as an NDA. It's a backdoor way to make an NDA without saying you're making an NDA, because non-disparagement, again, is so broad. You can't say anything to embarrass or disparage the leaders, but that is subjective. What does it mean to disparage them? You can say things that are true, and that need to be said that would disparage them. But you're going to see a lot of pastors, a lot of church leaders are using this exact tactic. You're going to see it. So you're not just hearing about it from BADs. You're going to see it today. They're using these things to get away with doing NDAs while saying the whole time, guys, come on, we don't use those, not at our church. You're going to catch some pastors in some lies just by knowing this tool. So if you're ever talking to a pastor, you're talking to church leaders, and you're asking them, do you use NDAs? And they start giving you this language, no, but all we use are severance agreements with non-disparagement provisions. Oh, okay, well then that means you're using an NDA. So this is very interesting, very important to know.
Routinely counsel my clients against signing anything that contains a non-disparagement provision because it is a subjective term, it's not defined, and it's usually these types of provisions don't have an end life. They go on and on and on. So you have to spend the rest of your life wondering if what I just said to somebody, even in passing, violates my non-disparagement provision, of which I got a little bit of money 10 years ago, but now they can come after me for violating that agreement. So that's a 1,000-foot view of this whole issue of what is an NDA.
All right, so Boz says non-disparagement provisions are so dangerous that he actually advises all of his clients to never sign a non-disparagement clause. Never sign anything that has a non-disparagement provision regardless, because that's one of the most dangerous parts and most troublesome parts of an NDA. Yeah, again, you're going to see it's one of the parts that churches use most often, and that's a big problem from my vantage point. So now that we have an idea of what NDAs are, how they're used in business, how they're used in churches, and specifically what makes a good NDA versus a bad NDA, let's take just a second, let's back up, and let's look all the way at the beginning. What were NDAs started for? What were they used for? And then how have we gotten off track, and why is it so dangerous that we've gotten off track? And why is it so dangerous that we've gotten off track this way in the church? So what were NDAs used for initially? NDAs really came on the scene hard in the 1980s with the boom of the tech industry, and they were primarily used to keep in the tech industry from sharing trade secrets from one employer to another. When done right, according to a Forbes article, these agreements should be specific and limited to protecting business practices and proprietary information. So these agreements, to be good, to be doing what they were designed to do, they need to be limited, specific, and tied to proprietary business information. With that in mind, let's take a look at a Harvard Business Review article and see what they have to say about these NDAs. At the outset, NDAs attempt to impose several obligations upon a new employee. They demand silence, often broadly worded to protect against speaking up against corporate culture or saying anything that would portray the company and its executives in a negative light. Now, that's what they're doing now. That's not what they were designed to do from the beginning, but this is what they've become. So instead of protecting business secrets, we're keeping people from speaking up about bad cultures, and we're keeping people from saying even true things, anything that would cause leaders in business and now in church from being cast in a negative light. That also keeps leaders from getting better, cultures from improving, and it keeps abuse and scandals from coming to the light early when they can still be addressed. The same article continues and says, moreover, a new common extension of NDAs is the inclusion of a non-disparagement clause. The same thing that Boz was just talking about, that's what HBR is talking about. The Harvard Business Review says this is a new thing, and they're saying from a secular standpoint, it's a dangerous thing, just like Boz did. So a new common extension of NDAs is the inclusion of a non-disparagement clause, which beyond the protection of concrete corporate information, requires employees to never speak negatively about their employer or former employer. Now, do we want people speaking negatively about us after we've employed them? No. But are there times where they need to be able to speak negatively about us? Yes. Negatively doesn't mean false. Negatively just means we're making you sign these non-disparagement clauses so that you can never say anything that makes us look bad, even if the things we're doing should make us look bad. So these non-disparagement clauses are the opposite of transparency, the opposite of accountability, and they allow bad leaders to keep leading in a bad way, and in some cases, they allow abusers to keep abusing while never actually having to have accountability, get better, or pay the price, pay the penalty for their crimes and the things that they're doing. Kelly Duford, co-founder of Duford Law, said, according to a Forbes article, that while there are valid reasons for companies to ask employees to sign NDAs, so she says there are valid reasons, but even though there are those valid reasons, those reasons should be limited. This is what we talked about at the start. They should be limited to protecting business practices and proprietary information, not culture and harassment in the workplace. Anytime, and this is another secular attorney who says anytime NDAs are protecting something above and beyond proprietary business practices, okay, or trademark secrets, then they're in the wrong. We should never use, according to this secular attorney, we should never use NDAs to try to protect bad cultures or to try to cover up harassment or abuse in the workplace. So if a secular attorney is saying that, we've got Boz Savigin saying that from a Christian perspective, and we're seeing that a lot of these red flags that John Farrell talked about earlier are in these new NDAs. Well, then what we know is NDAs have gotten really far off of the purpose they were designed for in both the business world and the church world. And that's what makes these new NDAs so dangerous. Even secular culture. Take the Christian part of it out for a second. We're not talking about church culture. We're talking about secular culture. Even secular culture has deemed these overly broad silencing NDAs as dangerous, so much so that they've literally made them illegal. That's right. Early in 2023, about February of 2023, these were made illegal. And here's the reason why. Over a third of Americans were estimated to be bound by such silencing agreements. Over a third of all Americans were bound by an agreement and they couldn't even talk about it. If we let this keep going on, almost everyone in America would eventually be silenced and we wouldn't have a culture of truth-telling at all. So secular leaders and even government leaders said, hey, this is a problem. This is not going to end well. We have to stop this. According to another Forbes article, it says that companies from all industries are being exposed. They're being exposed for their corrupt NDA practices to cover up hostile work environments. Why did we need to do something about this? Because these were corrupt practices using NDAs to cover up things that needed to be dealt with. And again, that's from a secular perspective. But one of the bigger dangers with this, and Boz talked about it for just a little bit, but in these NDAs, these newer NDAs, it had become a question of what does confidentiality even mean? What does confidentiality even mean? Because when we don't have a good definition, then it silences you from everything. So that same Forbes article, it says an NDA should be reasonable and specific about what's considered confidential and non-confidential. We've got to really clarify what's confidential and what is not. Language that is too broad, unreasonable, or onerous can void the agreement. It can void the agreement. Courts will also challenge or invalidate agreements that are overly expansive, oppressive, or try to cover non-confidential information. So these NDAs have gotten so bad that many of them would be struck down in courts. But you know what most individuals, most Americans are not going to do? They're not going to try to challenge a big corporation with almost unlimited legal funds to see if it'll get thrown out in court. So even when these are unlawful, they're still holding people in silence. And again, this is not just in the corporate world. I have sat across from pastors as I have heard them say, well, if they want to try to take this to court, we'll outlast them and we'll take them for everything that they're worth because we have more money than them and we can outlast them in a legal battle. I have heard that face to face with church leaders. So this is not just a corporate issue. It is a church issue because any big corporation or any big church, they have greater funds and resources to fight a legal battle than the individual does. So even if a person knows the NDA is unlawful and they think they can win the lawsuit, for most people, they're going to suffer in silence. They're going to stay silenced by fear because they don't think that they can stand toe to toe with these really big corporations and the money that they have, the legal resources that they have. According to Godfrey Law, again, we're going to secular attorneys on this. Godfrey Law says it this way: many NDAs look reasonable at first, but once you dig deeper, you find that there are a lot of issues. There's no transparency or accountability. The organizations who create them tend to use them as they wish, plus they are permanent. That brings us back to what Boz said to watch out for. It brings us back to John Farrell's red flags of a bad NDA. Godfrey Legal echoes the same thing. Many of these look reasonable, but when you really dig deeper into them and understand what they're saying, they're not reasonable at all. And one of the big reasons is because they last a lifetime. They're permanent. They're for forever. And I actually have some people in my life who have seen NDAs, and they'll say things like this. They'll say, well, NDAs really aren't that bad in the church. I mean, come on, Jeff. Businesses use them all the time. Pretty much every business uses them. Yes, you're correct. And because pretty much every business uses them and every big business was using these in such an inappropriate way, it was actually made illegal to use them in this way. So just because businesses have used them in the past and just because businesses use them in the wrong way is no excuse for churches to use them in the wrong way. Right? And they're just covering stuff up. There's no room for this in the business world. There's no room for this, especially in churches. Godfrey Legal continues. They said NDAs are most often used by organizations. How are NDAs most often used? Here's what they say. By organizations in which leaders have been accused of sexual, spiritual, and other types of abuse. NDAs are most used according to Godfrey Law. This isn't my opinion. This is written by Godfrey Law. These NDAs are most used to cover up sexual, spiritual, and other types of abuse. They're used to cover up for leaders who have been accused of something, and we never find out if there's truth to it or not. And when we don't find out if there's truth to it or not, this allows abusers to keep abusing. It allows predators to keep preying on innocent people, all because good people who know the truth can't say a word because they're muzzled by a bad NDA. So let's talk about the ruling earlier this year by the National Labor Relations Board, where they finally took a stand and ruled this kind of language, these kind of backdoor NDAs illegal. And you're going to see in their ruling, as they're talking about this, you're going to see the reasons why they made these illegal are some of the same things that Boz has already talked about, some of the same things that Godfrey Law talked about, some of the same things that John Farrell talked about, right? These things were being used in an inappropriate way. So the National Labor Board, the National Labor Relations Board stepped in, ruled them illegal in February of 2023. And they said overbroad non-disparagement clauses are unlawful because they take away a worker's rights. They're unlawful because they take away a worker's rights. So you'll see right here from the National Labor Relations Board website and their press release about it. It was February 21st of this year that the board ruled that employers may not offer severance agreements requiring employees to broadly waive their labor law rights. They go on and say today the board issued a decision in the case returning to the long-standing precedent that holds that employers may not offer employees severance agreements. Remember, they're not just saying NDAs, these are severance agreements to broadly waive their rights under the National Labor Relations Act. So What does that mean? Well, it says the decision involved severance agreements offered to furloughed employees that prohibited them from making statements that could disparage the employer and from disclosing the terms of the agreement itself. That is almost every non-disparagement clause, every non-disparagement provision that you will ever see. So it's literally these non-disparagement provisions in severance agreements are the main reason why the National Labor Board said this is illegal, this is not right, this is infringing on people's rights, and it's causing damage. Keep that in mind, because again, you're going to hear some of the same excuses that church leaders are using for still doing this, because they don't even realize what the secular world thinks about this. The reasons they're using as excuses to keep doing this are the actual reasons why this was made illegal. Okay, it says today's decision, okay, talking about this, today's decision in contrast explains that simply offering employees a severance agreement that requires them to broadly give up their rights, okay, it violates the laws that are already in the books. The board observed that the employer's offer is itself an attempt to deter employees from exercising their statutory rights. What that means, the offer of a severance itself with that non-disparagement clause is an attempt to keep people from using their rights and talking about things that need to be talked about. And it says this happens at a time when employees may feel that they must give up their rights in order to get the benefits provided in this agreement. So why do they give you this agreement and try to keep you quiet? Because at a time when you need money most, they believe that for a severance, for just a little bit of hush money, they can keep you quiet about things that you should be talking about, and they can keep you quiet for the rest of your life. And the National Labor Relations Board says, hey, that's not right. When you have some other law firms and lawyers talking about this, one law firm says, hey, the National Labor Relations Board finds confidentiality and non-disparagement clauses in severance agreements unlawful. So that was their take on this, that the simplest way to talk about what the National Labor Board just did is that non-disparagement clauses in severance agreements are unlawful. And that's exactly what you're going to see in some of these real life severance agreements that are being used by churches today. Axios, they put out an article that says the Labor Board says non-disparagement clauses are unlawful, and here's what it means. Overly broad non-disparagement clauses, which some companies and churches require workers to sign in order to receive severance benefits, were recently ruled unlawful by the National Labor Relations Board. And in a memo last week, the agency's general counsel made clear that the ruling was even retroactive. Okay, and that means that back before February of this year, NDAs that use this language, they no longer could actually hold you to silence. So not only did the National Labor Relations Board say this is illegal, they said we're going to release people essentially from these NDAs. Okay, so why does it matter? Axios says it matters for this reason. The ruling and guidance could free workers to speak up about what happened inside their companies before they lost their jobs, right? So we have this. Fast forward just a little bit, and by March, you see things like this article from Gibson Dunn Law. The NLRB doubles down on restrictions on confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions in severance agreements, right? And this goes, they just keep doubling down, and they're saying, hey, these things are wrong, and they're giving workers more and more freedom. They're giving more and more guidance to say to companies, you can't do this anymore. We're going to put a stop to this, right? From White Case, NLRB requires changes to employee severance and other agreements. But here's the problem. The only types of organizations that aren't held to this law right now, there were exemptions given to religious institutions. Why? Because of things like the separation of church and state, because of religious freedoms, because of those things where the government often doesn't get involved with churches in the same way, which I think is a really good thing. But what that's allowed is that churches have some exemptions, and our churches are allowed to do some of the things that the National Labor Relations Board says no company should ever be doing. These are so bad and so damaging and so wrong that no secular company should do them. And there's a lawful penalty to pay if you use this kind of language. Yet many churches are hiding behind that exemption, and they are still using them even after this ruling and after they know this ruling. Actually, later on in this expose, you're going to hear from an actual church elder board that gave excuses after knowing about this, and after knowing it was unlawful, they gave excuses why they were still going to use them at their church. So even when they knew this was wrong and unlawful, they doubled down and basically said, because we're a church, we're going to keep using them for as long as we can. And guys, that's just plain wrong. Doesn't matter how you slice it. That's wrong. And it's got to stop. Churches are supposed to be above reproach. Churches are supposed to be more transparent and held to a higher rate of accountability, not less. Yet right now, we've got church leaders who are using these agreements and doing things that big corporations aren't even allowed to do by law. And they're going to use them for as long as we allow them to use them. So, we can't wait on the government to step in and do this. As Christians, we've got to say it's our role to make sure that our churches aren't doing this. These things have no place in the church. So Scott McKnight, the author of A Church Called Tove, he does a lot of work with Grace and Boz Tavidjian. He was a part of that conversation with Boz earlier. We're going to hear more from him as we go on. But here's what Scott actually had to say about this exemption. He said, I'm told that churches and religious institutions are exempt from some features of the NLRA. Fair enough. In fact, here's the ruling. Here's what it said. Religious organizations. The board will not assert jurisdiction over employees of a religious organization who are involved in effectuating the religious purpose of the organization, such as teachers in church-operated schools. The board has asserted jurisdiction over employees who work in the operations of a religious organization that did not have a religious character, such as a healthcare institution. So still broad. We still don't know exactly what it means, but this is basically the National Labor Relations Board saying, hey, we're going to be really careful to hold religious institutions to this because of religious freedom and everything else. But doesn't it just make sense that if the secular world has decided that these agreements are so bad, so damaging, and so wrong that they've been ruled unlawful, that churches would follow suit even if they're not made to do that? I don't know about you, but I don't want my church doing anything they know is unlawful and saying, oh, it's okay, we know it's illegal, but we're doing it because we can, right? While there may be some places for that in persecuted countries, this isn't about persecution. This is actually saying we're going to do something we know is illegal because we can, so that we can continue to persecute our own people. That's wrong. That shouldn't happen. Talking further about the danger of these different agreements, Forbes article that we were reading earlier, it says these agreements are now used to silence employees in exchange for a financial incentive payment. That is literally the definition of hush money. Okay, you are silencing employees in exchange for a financial payment. It says usually at the time of employee termination. It's used to silence abuse victims, they say, across industries. And they give examples of the NDAs that Harvey Weinstein made people sign to cover up abuses, and some of the NDAs that even came out with people like Donald Trump. Non-disparagement clauses, they've broadened this kind of stuff. They broaden these kind of cover-ups to a dangerous degree. And according to the Forbes article talking about these again in secular environments, that when you sign such agreements, you can't say anything negative, or you can't even make a comment that could be perceived as negative. If you make a comment that could even be perceived as negative by somebody in that company, they could sue you for breaking the agreement. Worse off, they talk about this. You've already heard this from a few different places, but in most of these non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement agreements, you are not even allowed, when they're done in this poor way, this is why it was made illegal, you're not even allowed to acknowledge the existence of the agreement itself. This is not to protect against gossip, and it is not to protect against false accusations. That non-disparagement clause, okay, it's not needed. There are already laws in place for things like libel and slander and defamation. You already have laws to protect you that says people can't just go tell lies about you and your company, right? But what those laws protect is it's not slander, it's not libel, it's not defamation if what they're saying is true. What these non-disparagement agreements, what these non-disclosure agreements do is they say you can't say anything about us that's negative even if it is true. What does that mean? It means that you're forced to lie because you can't even say no comment because of the NDA. You literally have to lie and say good things, say things that are different than what happened, different than the way that they are, just so that you can protect that NDA and keep from being sued. We have people lying on behalf of churches just so they won't be sued, right? Non-disparagement clauses are designed to keep people quiet about true things, factual things, and that's a problem. In a 2018 Harvard Business Review article, they actually titled it this way. And again, this was a couple of years before these were ruled illegal. But you have the Harvard Business Review, a secular institution. They say this: NDAs are out of control. They're out of control, and we have to do something about it. Now they've even been made illegal, yet NDAs are still being used broadly. It's the norm in the evangelical church. And you're going to hear evangelical leaders talking about that in this expose. As you hear from them later, you're going to hear them say time after time again, this is normal. This is just what we do, as they're trying to downplay the significance of these agreements. According to one large church that's known to use NDAs, they say this: NDAs have become standard practice in the American evangelical church. This is a big-time evangelical leader that says NDAs, hey, don't look at us, don't get mad at us because we're using them. Those are standard practice in evangelical circles, which means if you're part of the evangelical church, this may be standard practice in your church. But beyond the evangelical church, this is used all across different denominations. This is used by the Catholic Church, by the Mormon Church. This is used way too broadly in Christian circles. And now one of our excuses for using them is, hey, everybody does it. I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem like a valid excuse for me. So not only did that leader say that, but I want you to listen to Albert Tate, okay? Albert Tate is the pastor of Fellowship Church in Monrovia, California. He has spoken at big-time Christian events like the Global Leadership Summit. He's a big voice in evangelical circles. Recently, he's been under fire for some potential misconduct, inappropriate texting and sexual texting with, someone in his church. He's come under fire for that, but in the middle of this, it became known and reported that he and his church were using NDAs and large severance payments to silence people. And as they were talking about this in a recent town hall meeting at Fellowship Monrovia, he let the cat out of the bag that, again, this is just like the other leaders. This is standard practice in the church. So you may be looking at this and saying, Jeff, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. You're making this bigger than it should be. No, actually, most of us just have no idea how broadly these things are being used. So go ahead, listen to what Albert Tate has to say about their use in evangelical circles. So go ahead and listen to this. And actually, who you're going to be hearing from, the person talking, is one of Albert Tate's board members who's speaking on his behalf. Albert's actually in the middle, but you're going to see him nodding along to the whole thing. He doesn't say anything to change this. So this is Fellowship Monrovia's view of NDAs. Let's take a listen together.
Yeah, and the reason why that happens, and that just doesn't happen here, it happens in multiple churches. And the reason why it does is because what you don't want employees to do, remember, this is a place in which sinners come, broken people come, broken families come. What you don't want is people to go out and share those types of things with other people. So it's very typical amongst churches that as they give a severance, there's a non-disclosure, but it's only, what it does is, it's not an NDA, what most of us would perceive something from the corporate world, because I'm also in the corporate world as well. that NDA validates the confidentiality agreement that they signed when they first become employees.
All right, so you heard him say this isn't just us. This is something multiple churches use. And then at the end of him talking about this, he says, hey, this isn't just us. This is typical. This is typical amongst churches. And you're going to hear more from that conversation later as they try to weasel their way around why they're not really using NDAs and why their NDAs aren't like something from the corporate world is how he says it. And what you're going to actually see is they're just like the ones from the corporate world and even worse. And they're doing it after it's been stopped in the corporate world. But it's not just these handful of evangelical leaders who have said this. Let's actually take a look at some information found by the Wartburg Watch. The Wartburg Watch had some of their interns call around to different churches asking specific questions, and here's what they found. It says, one of our interns did the hard work of calling a bunch of these mega churches around the country to ask what their policies were. And a lot of the biggest churches in the country, hear that, the biggest churches in the country use non-compete clauses. They use non-disparagement clauses, which is the worst part of a bad non-disclosure agreement. And these non-disclosure agreements in severance packages most predominantly, but also just as a matter of policy, which means in their employee handbook. Someone who is financially stressed may be forced to sign one. And that is, again, that's something that's been used by multiple attorneys, and it's used here by the Wartburg Watch. The way that these are being used, not only are they being used broadly in evangelical churches, and most megachurches are using them, but they're being used more often than not when a person's at their lowest, when they've just lost their job, they're scared to death, they don't know what's next, and because of the offerance of severance, they're forced to sign these. Now, this isn't something that I just know about from other people. This is something that my wife and I have actually had to live through. And I can tell you, as someone who didn't sign an NDA, when my wife refused to sign her NDA because they kept saying, we want to be generous to you, we want to take care of you and your family, we want to be a blessing, yet the moment she refused to sign the NDA, they pulled the severance and all of the blessings off of the table, because the severance was only there to force you to sign something that would make you stay silent and allow them to control you and to control the narrative. At least that was our experience, and it's been the experience of many, almost all of the people that I've talked to, that I have interviewed, the severances that I've seen. This is standard practice, and guys, it's not just standard practice, it's blatantly sinful practice in churches. Worst off, you'll notice in that Wartburg Watch article, a lot of people tend to think, when they think about things like abuse cases and abuse being hidden in the church, a lot of us tend to still think about the Catholic Church. Yet in that article, the Wartburg Watch said that, Protestants may actually be behind the Catholic Church in matters of transparency, because the Catholic Church has made changes and done things to become more transparent, while the Protestant church and evangelical circles, we're just sitting back on our heels and we're trying to use these NDAs and all these things for as long as we can. And guys, what it's actually made is maybe these larger mega churches, evangelical churches that are using NDAs, may be the least transparent and some of the most dangerous churches on the planet today. We got to have a reckoning. We don't need to wait until scandal after scandal comes out. We can say today, we're going to stop and we're going to make sure that NDAs have no places in our churches, because that's not what Jesus wants. And we're going to get into later on the expose some things that you can do to try to affect change at your church on a grassroots level. But we're going to get there a little later. For now, let's continue. According to religion news services, not every church that uses NDAs is abusive, okay? So there are churches that use NDAs to protect some things that should be protected, but that's the exception, not the rule. But they say it this way: not every church that uses NDAs is abusive, but every church found to be covering up abuse and embroiled in scandal have used them. Every single church that we have found in recent years that's embroiled in scandal or covering up abuse, they have used NDAs. And that should be enough right there to tell us that NDAs, they have no place in the church. We need to get them out of the church. Going back to the Godfrey Law article from earlier, these secular lawyers, Godfrey Law says the religion field is especially known for NDAs. Let that sink in. Hear that. Let that break your heart for a moment. The religion field is especially known for using NDAs and using them to abuse others and keep it a secret. For any Christian, any Christ follower, any human, that should break our hearts. And I work with churches all the time. And I'm going to tell you, most church leaders that I know, they love people, they protect people, they are transparent. The problem is we've got too many of these bad actors at the top who are trying to hold on to power, who are doing this kind of stuff. And not only are they abusing and hurting people, they're making everybody else in the church look bad. It's time that we run these predators and these people and these abusers and these liars out of the church, because they don't represent most of the Christians I know. They don't represent most of the churches and the church leadership that I know. Yeah, at the top, again, many of these people, these leaders can be using NDAs, and other people in leadership in the church have no idea that their church uses NDAs. It wasn't until toward the end of my day-to-day ministry career that I realized that some churches I'd been at used NDAs, and I realized the church I had worked at for 5 years used NDAs just toward the end. This is one of the church's best-kept secrets, and it's one of the secrets that has to get out. Because if this stays happening in the shadows of churches, all we're going to do is hurt people, and we're going to make Christians, we're going to make Christianity, we're going to make the name of Jesus look bad. We have to do something about this. Christianity Today notes in one of their articles, most of these NDAs also state that signers can't tell anyone that they signed the NDA. So this is the third or fourth time we've talked about people not even being able to acknowledge the existence of these NDAs. And that's a huge, huge problem. So Christianity Today says that cloaks even the secrecy in secrecy, right? It cloaks even the secrecy of the way these churches are handling this in secrecy to keep it under wraps, to keep it in the shadows. And CT reporter Daniel Silliman, he tweeted this. He said that after reviewing 15 to 20 confidentiality agreements, okay? So he's writing a story about confidentiality agreements in the church. And as he's doing that, he got the chance to review 15 to 20 of these agreements. Yet most of the agreements that reporters get, they can't actually put out there for you to see. So even though we can review them and tell you about them, most reporters are never going to be able to show you. At the end of this expose, that's why you want to stay to the end, we're going to show you. We have gotten our hands on multiple NDAs. We're going to show you what they actually look like so you can see with your own two eyes. But Daniel Silliman says he got his hands on 15 to 20 of these confidentiality agreements, and in reviewing them, he discovered that many are so broad that someone who signs them could be in violation at almost any time. They're so broad that at almost any time that church could probably come after you. And that's why so many people who sign these literally live in fear for decades upon decades, because they're always looking over their shoulder wondering, did that thing I just said or that thing I just did, could that have broken my NDA? Guys, that is a terrible, terrifying way to live. And nobody should have to live that way. According to Lee Fernie, one of the founders of the organization NDA Free that exists to stop the use and eradicate the use of NDAs in the church, he said this to Christianity Today. In some ways, NDAs can look reasonable, but find for me the perfect NDA and it's still not perfect. There's no transparency. There's no accountability. You can't track these NDAs or how they're used, and they're binding the conscience for the future, saying, I can't change my mind, regardless of the situation, regardless of what I find out, regardless of how deep I find out this rabbit hole goes and how many people are being hurt, I can never say anything. So it may become a matter of conscience, Lee Fernie says, where a person's conscience is being broken because they feel like they're contributing to abuse because they signed that NDA years or decades ago. Daniel Silliman with Christianity Today, again, he wrote, non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality clauses are often quite expansive, with broad and sometimes open-ended definitions of confidential. Now, remember, the first attorney that we listened to earlier, John Farrell, he said those broad definitions of confidential, you need to know what they mean, or those broad definitions are a red flag. Daniel Silliman said one agreement that he reviewed with Christianity Today included the names of anyone the person had ever worked for or worked with in the parachurch organization. Any information that could be deemed damaging or disparaging, which again is hugely subjective, and any information regarding ministries. Once you put that clause in there, any information regarding ministries, you literally can't talk about anything that happened, even public stuff that happened. And he says most NDAs include prohibitions against disclosing the non-disclosure agreement, again, cloaking even the secrecy in secrecy. That keeps coming up, that you can't even talk about these agreements. Diane Langberg, who is a Christian psychologist who specializes in religious trauma and helping people heal from spiritual abuse, she put it this way: I've been concerned and grieved for years by the statement, quote, our church required that we sign an NDA. There would be no compensation if we ever spoke about what happened, end quote. In other words, humans who have been mistreated, abused, or used in some fashion must keep silent, or the church would, bluntly put, do harm to them and or their reputation. She says it is my understanding that some churches are actually requiring signed NDAs to even become a member. And what Diane Langberg is talking about there, it's the same thing that Boss Davidjian talked about earlier, that some churches are requiring membership covenants to be signed that have these cleverly cloaked NDAs or non-disparagement clauses put in them, usually under the guise of protecting the unity of the church and protecting against gossip, even though that's really not what they're protecting against at all. She said this as well, Diane Langberg, about non-disclosure agreements. Disclose means to reveal, to allow something covered to be seen, to uncover. Non-disclosure is to cover up or to hide away. To agree with something is to consent, like-mindedness, and an NDA is an agreement to hide something. And she finishes this way: so a Christian is asked to agree to cover up wrongdoing for the sake of the system, or worse, for the sake of God's reputation. She says that's what an NDA is. When you present someone with an NDA in the church, you're asking a Christian to agree to hide something, to agree to deceive, to agree to hide the church. Ministry Watch writes it this way: healthy churches may use non-disclosure agreements for legitimate ends. Again, everybody we talked to has said there may be some legitimate ends, some legitimate use cases for NDAs in the church. They're just few and far between, okay? So Ministry Watch is talking about this, and they said some of those legitimate ends are things such as preventing staff members from divulging who puts how much into the offering plate. But unhealthy churches, including Mars Hill Church, Harvest Bible Chapel, and Willow Creek Community Church, have weaponized legal agreements for various kinds to silence members and staff who were troubled by habitual sin, financial fraud, and cultic practices. They literally say the majority of these NDAs they've seen have been weaponized by the church to silence people about habitual sin, financial fraud, and cultic practices. If you had financial fraud, habitual sin, or cultic practices in your church that people had evidence of, wouldn't you want them to bring that to light so that your church could fix it, so that your church could get healthy, so that your church could even help restore the leaders who are involved in this? I think you would, at least I would, yet these agreements keep that from ever happening. Daniel Silliman with Christianity Today, he continued this way: the Christian organizations using NDAs agree there can be issues with transparency and abuse, but they argue that confidentiality is not always a sign of cover-up. So when he's been interviewing churches about this, all the churches he talked about, they agreed, yes, NDAs can be a problem. Yes, NDAs can be used to cover up abuse, but instead of doing anything about it, they just argued the reason they still use them is because confidentiality is not always a sign of a cover-up. But I'm just going to go ahead and say it this way. If your church is making people sign non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement agreements, they're requiring this kind of confidentiality, 90% of the time or more, from my experience, which is pretty broad at this point, 90% of the time or more, it is to cover something up. So if it's being used that often to cover up abuse, to hide sin, then it doesn't matter if some of them are legitimate. If it's causing that much damage, as church leaders, we need to we need to get courageous and simply say, regardless of whether they can be used okay sometimes, most of the time they're not, so we're getting these out of our churches. They don't belong anymore. And it's time for church leaders, denominational leaders, for us to simply say, NDAs have no place in the church, we will not use them, and if we have ever used them in the past, give a public release to anyone covered by an NDA. There's no excuse to keep using such tools that are hiding sin, that are covering up abuse, and that are covering up the mistreatment of people, period. There's no way around it. That doesn't honor God. And if you are a church leader who is listening to this, you're watching this expose, and even with what you've seen already, and guys, there is so much more to come, okay? But if you can't come to that conclusion with what you've seen already, then something is wrong with you and you may not be fit for ministry. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. We've got to get these out of our churches. If this isn't breaking your heart and feeling real to you yet, maybe this will help. Let's take a look at a story that was published by Premier Christianity, where you have a worker who worked for a Christian institution, a parachurch type ministry, and they anonymously talk about their NDA. They have to change some of the details here and talk anonymously. Why? Because they're afraid even now that the organization will come after them, try to sue them, try to destroy their lives if they find out that they've talked about it. So from Premier Christianity, which is the UK's leading Christian magazine, they say this: the title of the article, "A Christian Charity Pressured Me to Sign a Non-Disclosure Agreement. A tingling sensation came over me as he dangled the carrot." And here was the carrot that got dangled by this person's leader to them: 2 years of salary in return for a quiet exit from the Christian charity I had served at for 20 years. This person had given to this charity for 20 years. And when they blew the whistle on some things that didn't need to be going on, they were given a quick firing, a quick exit. And here was the carrot dangled on the stick: as long as you'll be quiet, we'll give you 2 years of salary. Now, I don't know about you, but 2 years of salary feels like a really big hush money payment to me. If they're offering you 2 full years of salary for your silence, it's because they're really scared that you're going to talk about something that you know. And that usually means you should be talking about it a ton. But who, when they lose their job, is going to turn down 2 years of salary? Most people aren't. And that's how they keep you silent. So when we're talking about these hush money payments, even though some of these severances are really low, they're going to pay what they need to pay to keep you silent. It's just for some people, they know that just a few weeks of salary is going to keep them silent. For others, they know it may need to be 2 years of salary or hundreds of thousands of dollars. She continues, I'm just going to hit the highlights of these, but he underlined repeatedly that it was my choice. But in reality, there was no real choice. Even in my exhaustion and depression, after months of sleep deprivation and stress brought about by standing up for what I believed I was right. Now keep that. Months of sleep deprivation, months of exhaustion and depression because this person had been trying to blow the whistle, standing up for things that were right and standing against sin that they had witnessed. After months of that, I knew that what I was being offered flew in the face of the Christian values held deeply by both of us. And this person is saying, hey, you know what? I've already been through months of this. Do I continue going through this depression, this exhaustion? Do I continue going through this trauma? Or do I just call it quits? And do I take 2 years of salary and do I sign something that goes against my conscience and goes against everything that I believe and everything that my boss who's doing this to me is supposed to believe, because it goes against Christianity? They said, while I could console myself with the fact that I had done the right thing by bringing up my concerns to the chair, I felt deeply conflicted by being asked to choose between financially providing for my family or pursuing truth and justice. And that's the choice that so many face. Do I provide for my family, or do I pursue truth and justice and not only not provide for them, but this church and these leaders and all of the money that they have in this organization may come after me and try to destroy my character? For most people, that's an easy and valid choice. I'll be quiet as much as I hate it to protect my family. There are very few who have been able to make the tougher choice because most people are not in the position where they can. But guys, this is terrible. Put yourself in this situation. Could you imagine being forced to make this choice? They said, on the advice of my Christian lawyer, who told me I was being offered double what he could achieve in court, I signed the settlement contract and I received the payment. That was 2018. So again, not that long ago, about 5 years ago. To this day, I am legally gagged from telling you exactly what took place while I worked for this charity. So this person makes the choice that makes so much sense to take care of their family. Yet 5 years later, they are legally gagged from telling you why they left, what they were asked to be silenced against, and it was so bad that they were willing to lose their job over it because they couldn't stay silent about it. I don't know about you, but it bothers me to my core that whatever that was is still going on in this Christian organization. Why is this person writing about it anonymously now? Even though they can't tell you what's going on and they can't stop it, they're writing anonymously about these NDAs because they are struggling to live with the guilt of what is still going on because they signed that NDA. And that's what many people who sign NDAs go through. They live with guilt for the rest of their life that they signed the NDA and they didn't tell the truth. This isn't something that goes away. You're legally gagged for life, but also you may deal with guilt for life. While the secretive nature of NDAs makes research difficult, they say in this article their use is widespread and growing. And again, because people can't even talk about the existence of the agreement, it is really hard to prove churches are using these agreements. It's really hard to get your hands on them. Yet, over the last few years, more and more of them are popping up. He says their use is widespread and growing. It's becoming the norm in evangelical churches. And he says, I am aware of at least 5 other colleagues at the same Christian charity who have either signed or been asked to sign NDAs relating to abuse of power allegations. So they know of, 4 to 5 other people who have signed these. I know of hundreds who have signed them. They can't go on the record. They can't give me their NDA, but I have been able to confirm hundreds who have signed them from just one organization. Beyond that, I know of organizations all over the country where I've confirmed they've signed them. But from one organization, I know of hundreds that have signed these. This is a big, big problem. And all of these people are signing these. All of these people are going through the same thing, and they think they're alone because they don't know that other people have signed them. Okay? It says this is not an isolated example. And I can confirm that. This is not an isolated example. It happens all too often. While it may be difficult to understand why Christians would resort to NDAs, there are 2 key concepts from social psychology that's helpful to have in mind when exploring why NDAs are employed. Okay? And here they go. The first is cognitive dissonance. And we've talked about that on previous podcasts. Cognitive dissonance is a really big deal. They say when a person engages in an action that conflicts with one or more of their deeply held beliefs, ideas, or values, psychological stress may result. So when we find out that our church that we love or church leaders that we believed in are doing something inappropriate or sinful, our brain wants to resolve that. Our brain does not want to believe it, okay? And it results in psychological stress. According to the theory of cognitive dissonance, that person will do everything in their power to change the circumstances until that feeling of distress is alleviated. And I've seen that exact same thing to be true. I've seen people who, even when we have presented them with the NDAs that were presented to us, with NDAs being used in these churches, they find any reason possible to excuse their church leaders, not because they're bad people and not because they can't see the evidence, but because they're experiencing such stress and such cognitive dissonance that their brain is doing everything possible to rewrite the story in a way that allows them to stay at their church and believe that these things aren't really going on. And what that normally results in is when you do have a whistleblower, you do have someone who puts these things out there, they get ostracized by their community and they become the villain of the story as people are dealing with this cognitive dissonance, right? It talks about, going on in this article, it talks about, the reputational damage that could happen to the person and that could happen to the organization. And the writer says this: in values-based organizations, such as Christian charities, public image is crucial, both for the legitimacy of the organization and for fundraising. When faced with a crisis that threatens the organization's reputation, organizations often seem to prioritize managing image over managing the problem. And again, everything this person's written about, I've seen to be true from my work as a pastor, from my work as a church consultant. It is often easier, and it becomes the priority to manage our image and to limit the reputational damage of something that's going on than to actually deal with the problem and protect people from being hurt again in the future. Toward the end of the article, in a section called Misuse and Abuse, the writer continues, NDAs rely on intimidation. NDAs, plain and simply, rely on intimidation. If an employee breaks an NDA by speaking out, they risk not just any settlement payment, but the cost of legal fees and potentially damages, which could be hundreds of thousands of dollars that they don't have. And here's the kicker, we talked about it already. Most of the time, the organization suing them does have that money, and they're willing to use that money to protect their reputation. And then the final thing that they say in this premier Christianity story, Christian organizations must prioritize a process of robust and safe reporting, including whistleblowing. I completely agree. Christian organizations, charities, churches, we must prioritize robust and safe reporting as well as accountability. And they must ensure the protection of human dignity, independent investigation, transparency, and accountability. They go on, the writer, to say it's going to take courageous leadership, but it's definitely worth it because we've got to have that kind of courageous leadership. We've got to step up. We've got to say something. We got to change something if we're going to honor God and we're going to love people like Jesus loves them. This has got to change, and it can't keep happening in Christian circles. Now, we're just getting started. We're just scratching the surface of the tip of this iceberg of NDAs and the secrets they allow to be kept in the church, the damage that NDAs are doing. But as we finish out this first part of this expose on NDAs in the church, I want to finish it out by taking a look at some of the churches that we know and have confirmed by multiple sources to use NDAs. And you're going to recognize these. Many of these are very popular or were very popular, well-known, well-thought-of churches. So this should be a reminder, a sobering reminder to us that even churches we think are great churches that would never use these, they might be using these NDAs, because we didn't think that the churches and the organizations I'm about to talk about, we didn't think any of them used NDAs until the news broke that they actually did. And by the time the news broke, for every single one of these, there was a massive scandal. There was a massive black eye, not only to the organization, but more importantly, a massive black eye to Christianity and to the love of Jesus. So the first popular example of NDA use in Christian circles is one that most of us are familiar with. It's the Catholic Church. And in a Good Faith Media article, Alyssa Aldape writes it this way: say what you will about how our siblings of the broader Church of Jesus Christ conduct their own issues, but perhaps my Protestant siblings should ponder the NDA-sized beam in our own eyes before we judge the speck in others. The Wartburg Watch said it this way: the Catholic Church is actually farther ahead now than Protestants, but it's goes way beyond the Catholic Church. In recent years, it's really, again, the Protestants who have been making headlines, the worst headlines, with these NDAs. Churches like Mars Hill Church. Mars Hill was one of the fastest growing churches in the country, in the Seattle area, led by famous pastor Mark Driscoll at the time, had celebrities, NFL football players, all kinds of people were coming to his church. He was kind of the darling of a lot of evangelical circles until it came out that he was involved in quite a few different scandals. There was a lot of allegations of abuse. If you don't know that story, you can find out in detail about that story in the podcast by Christianity Today, the series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. But when the scandals broke about Mars Hill that were so bad that it actually closed the doors to one of the largest churches in the country, it also came out that there was the prevalent use of NDAs. Mars Hill was known to use these NDAs. Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. Willow Creek was one of the kind of father churches that started this movement, this mega church movement in the evangelical world. They were one of the leaders of the seeker-sensitive movement, and their pastor, Bill Hybels, was known all over the world. He was a hero of the faith to many. He was the founder of the Global Leadership Summit, and you couldn't be in these megachurch Christian circles and not know about and respect Bill Hybels. That was until allegations began to surface one after another that had been hidden for years. Finally, there were a few brave souls that started talking about it, and one after another, these allegations came out, sexual allegations, abusive allegations, allegations of abuse of power, and before you know it, Bill Hybels is removed. But before he was removed, he had his board and church leaders take up for him and say, this couldn't be true. Church members take up for him and say it couldn't be true, until eventually the evidence came out. It was absolutely true. And what did we find out about Willow Creek, which is now just a shell of its former self? Thousands, tens of thousands of people have been hurt and traumatized and damaged through this thing coming out. A lot of abuse victims there, a lot of things that were hidden. What did we find out? Willow Creek had been using NDAs for years. Hillsong Church, popular for worship music that has went around the world, they were also one of these bastions of Christianity. They were a model that mega churches and wannabe mega churches from all over the world looked to, until in last years they've been embroiled in scandal, and their founding leader, who has now had to step down, Brian Houston, has been embroiled in scandal, from allegations of sexual misconduct to DUIs to other potential cover-ups. There's been a ton of stuff there. You can actually watch different documentaries about that, including the Vanity Fair documentary, The Secrets of Hillsong, and we're going to hear from some of the things they had to say about NDA use in our next episode. But one of the things that was crazy about Hillsong is the more scandals that came out, the more we heard about NDA use, not just with big-time staff members, but also with volunteers and maybe worst of all, college students at Hillsong College. Again, we've looked at this: Mars Hill, Willow Creek, and Hillsong, some of the biggest scandals in evangelical Christianity in the last decade. And in all of these scandals, NDAs were a part of the problem. NDAs were used. Now, Elevation Church, they've taken a lot of shots, but they haven't been involved in any huge, massive scandals like these others. Yeah, Elevation Church is known to use NDAs. Relentless Church, that is led by Pastor John Gray, famous pastor and speaker John Gray, has been known to use NDAs, and most recently have had some articles written that show they had an executive pastor who, because he talked about potential financial misconduct, actually broke his NDA. And because he said funds were being used inappropriately, they were reportedly funds from the church were used to buy John Gray's wife a car, and among other things, when he reported financial impropriety, which should be a good thing, what he actually did was break his NDA, which means it took some courage to do that, and he could take a lot of loss from breaking that NDA. The Southern Baptist Convention has been proven to use and confirmed that they have used a lot of NDAs. And in the past couple of years, what has been the big news story with the Southern Baptist Convention? Sexual abuse and cover-up on a massive scale. Why was this abuse covered up on such a massive scale? in large part to their use of NDAs. And it's not just the Southern Baptist Convention. In recent years, it's come out and been confirmed that Southern Baptist seminaries, the flagship seminaries across the Southern Baptist Convention, who are supposed to be teaching these new pastors and bright minds, they fire professors all the time and make them sign NDAs to keep them silent. So all over both the Southern Baptist Convention, Southern Baptist churches, and Southern Baptist seminaries, NDAs have been used. And many of you are familiar because this has happened just in recent years. Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Ravi Zacharias was known as one of the greatest Christian apologists of all time. I grew up listening to Ravi's programs like Let My People Think. And man, I had so much respect for this what I thought was a hero of the faith. And a few years ago, he passed away. Yet after his death, we find out that he was embroiled in, again, more scandal. Sexual abuse, sexual assault, all kinds of scandal. And what happened? When this broke, you had a lot of people from RZIM who said, it's not true, it can't be true, Ravi was an incredible guy, only for us to find out that there was a plethora of evidence that said, no, actually, he was doing things that nobody knew that he was doing, and the people who did know, guess what? They covered them up. And a lot of these cover-ups happened because, again, they were using NDAs. According to the Wartburg Watch, talking about RZIM, Ravi Zacharias, and his ministry, an NDA featured prominently in the Ravi Zacharias scandal. A woman abused by him settled a lawsuit in 2017, years before this came out, that included an NDA that prohibited her from warning other victims. So since this woman couldn't warn other victims, this continued to happen. Although Ravi died in early 2020, his estate refused to release her still from the NDA. Even after he died, his estate refused to release this woman from her NDA. Why? Because they knew what they were hiding. And they didn't care that it had resulted in more victims. They just wanted to hide it and protect this reputation of Ravi. And I get that, but we can never protect people's reputations over protecting people and protecting them from being able to live healthy lives. All right. So although he died in 2020, his estate refused to release her from the NDA, preventing her from participating in the subsequent investigation into his widespread sexual abuse. That actually came, not from the Wartburg Watch, that came from Ann Pfeiffer reporting. So even the investigation into this abuse scandal took longer than it should have, because there were people like this woman who were already victims and couldn't talk about it because they were silenced by NDAs. Now, the Wartburg Watch also talks about it and says this: Lori Ann suffered much at the hands of the Christian community when she spoke out about Ravi Zacharias. When she spoke out, the Christian community does often what we do. We want to protect our heroes. We want to protect our pastors. We want to protect our churches. And in that desire to protect our churches and pastors that we want to believe in, we attack. And just like we do it, Christians in the Christian community did this to Lori Ann Thompson. They attacked her, okay? They came out after her when she spoke about Ravi Zacharias. However, at the end of the day, what did we find out? We found out she was incredibly right, and we were deeply wrong to attack her. People who attacked her character and called her a liar and all of these things, when actually we were the liars because we refused to believe a victim. Zacharias will now be known as one of the biggest ministry scandals of this century. Yet even in one of the biggest ministry scandals of this century, Lori Ann was prevented from speaking by an NDA. That again, according to the Wartburg Watch. Acts 29, the church planting network that was started by Mark Driscoll of Mars Hill. It's been led by a lot of other people, including Matt Chandler from the Village Church. They have been known and confirmed to use NDAs. Echo Church, who you're going to hear more about in part 2 of this, Echo Church has been known to use NDAs when their former pastor, who is now the lead pastor at Saddleback Church in California, taking over from Rick Warren, when he was accused of power abuse and other allegations, Echo Church actually refused to release their staff from NDAs. So we still don't know what other evidence there is and what other allegations there are, because instead of trying to find out if people were mistreated or abused, We would instead, as Christians, often just protect people like Andy would so that he can go lead a bigger church now, which makes you wonder if any scandals break with Andy Wood and Saddleback in the future, could they have been prevented if Echo Church would simply release people from their NDAs, which they still refuse to do? More on that in later parts of this expose. We know that the Christian Reformed Church is known to be using NDAs and have been confirmed to use NDAs. The Church of England is confirmed to use NDAs. Faith Promise Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. That's my first experience with NDAs were with their NDAs, one of the largest churches in the state of Tennessee. Fellowship Monrovia in California, Albert Tate's church that we talked about. And you're going to hear a lot more from Albert Tate's church, because in that town hall meeting, a lot of things came out, and you're going to hear them tell what I believe to be some bold-faced lies as they use excuses and explain why they didn't use NDAs, that as we hear from other attorneys, they say flat out, actually, those are the worst kind of NDAs. But they are known to use NDAs, and even right now are protecting those NDAs as they're embroiled in scandal and they're fighting for their survival. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We could go on for hours and hours and hours about churches that have been confirmed to use NDAs. What's more scary, though, is that most of the churches who are using these NDAs, we cannot prove it, and we have not been able to confirm it, because no one has come through and broken their NDA yet. And until someone either breaks the NDA or someone refuses to sign and publishes the NDA, we'll never see them. And sadly, as you're going to hear again in later parts of this expose, this has become the norm. It's become the standard practice in way too many of our churches in evangelical circles. So, hey, we're just getting started on the problem of NDAs, but I'm gonna let you just sit on this for a minute. I don't know about you, this has broken my heart, and my prayer as we process through this episode 1, that we would be willing to say something has to be done, something has to change. This practice of using NDAs, covering up abuse, silencing people, putting a muzzle on people in the name of Jesus, it can't continue. But again, we've got so much more to talk about, so much more to share. You're going to hear details about Hillsong Church and their use of NDAs. You're going to hear Albert Tate and Monrovia Fellowship and their excuses about using NDAs. You're going to hear why Echo Church refused to let people out of their NDAs. And most importantly of all, we're actually going to break down real NDAs that people have signed and that people have refused to sign. You're going to see how sickening, how gross, and how damaging these NDAs are. And you're going to hear common lies that church leaders tell to try to make people think that these are okay, that they're reasonable, when they're really not. But we're going to actually start next episode by talking about why churches use NDAs. And we're going to hear from both proponents of NDAs and those who are against it. We're going to hear the best reasons that the church community is given for using NDAs, as well as the arguments against it. So I cannot wait to see you for the next episode, because as tough as this is, the more honest conversations we have about things like this, the more courageous people we have learn and take a stand after tough conversations like this, the more we can look like Jesus, the more we can protect people. And guys, I just believe this. I believe a reckoning is coming, and I believe it is time for a new reformation in the church. And that reformation centers around transparency, accountability, and loving and protecting people over our own reputations. So again, I hope you've learned something from this. I hope as you process this, that there is a holy anger that is rising up inside of you. An anger that doesn't lead to attacking anyone, but an anger that leads to saying, we have to change something. This can't continue. And I hope for church leaders who are watching this, that same anger is rising up in you, and that you're getting the courage to say, we've got to speak up against this. And if you're a part of a church that uses NDAs, I hope that you're getting the courage to say, you know what, we need to talk about this, because this isn't what we want to keep doing. But hey, again, we're just getting started. I'll see you soon. I'll see you next week for episode 2 of this expose on NDAs, silencing victims, hush money, and the secrets that we're keeping in the church. It's time to turn the light on and let the secrets out.